right. Thank you so much for joining us once again to an incredibly important, topical and timely Met webinar. I am really honored and delighted to call one of my dearest friends in Washington, and one of my long-term policy friends, Douglas Feith. Douglas has played a pivotal role in some of the most important decisions in recent American history. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he heads the Center for National Security Strategies. He's the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, War and Decision, Inside the Pentagon at the Dawn of the War on Terrorism, which I am actually holding right here. And if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend that you read this book. It really shows the lead up to the war in Iraq and what happened in the United States right after September 11th, 2001. Doug was a professor of national security studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute and a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. As Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from July 2001 until August 2005, he helped to design the U.S. government strategy for the war on terrorism and contributed to policymaking for the Afghanistan and the Iraq campaigns. Doug went to Harvard University as an undergraduate, where he graduated magna cum laude, and got his JD from Georgetown University. So without further ado, we will begin our discussion with Doug Feith. Doug, you wrote or were interviewed in a very, very interesting piece for policy, I think it was policy, and you have a very, very interesting perspective on what makes Hamas's way of engaging in warfare somewhat unique compared to the way others engage in warfare today or throughout history. Doug? I think you have to unmute yourself, Doug. Doug, I think your microphone is muted. If you could go down to the icon.
Connected?
Okay, great.
No, I lost you for a second and then it came back.
Okay, sorry. Okay, excellent. So, in your esteem, what do you feel makes the way Hamas conducts warfare unique in the history of waging warfare?
First of all, it's always nice to reconnect with you, Sarah, and I'm a fan of the work that you do with Emet, and happy to be here with you. I thought that that Hamas and Israel in May highlighted a phenomenon important. I think all students of war and politics and international law, what Hamas has done is something completely unprecedented in the history of war. They have developed that and that's a unique situation. There have been many cases in history where where combatants have used human shields. But what Hamas, Gaza, is simply hiding behind human beings as a human shield. They actually have developed, which is really part of an ideological war against Israel. But what they're interested in doing, since they recognize that they can't defeat the Israeli Defense Forces, they've developed what is known as an asymmetric strategy against Israel. And the asymmetric strategy is to enter into these wars. And I think this one in this past May was the third or fourth in the last 10 years or so. They enter into these wars for the purpose of damaging Israel in world opinion. And so the purpose of the conflict is not to try to defeat the Israeli Defense Forces. It's to provoke Israeli responses that Hamas can then use to make Israel look bad in the eyes of the world. And the way it's chosen to make Israel look bad, remarkably, is the Hamas people purposefully locate their weapons launchers, their military stockpiles, and base their operations in civilian areas, in apartment buildings, in schools, in hospitals, and the like. So that when the Israelis defend themselves, the Israelis have no choice to.
Doug, we're having a lot of difficulty. Unfortunately, your audio goes in and off. Is there a possibility to just turn off the visual and you could just connect auditorially, or to try to reconnect with us?
Okay, I can try to do it by my cell phone rather than computer, and we'll use cellular.
That would be excellent, excellent. Raisi, Ibrahim Raisi, who has, killed at least 3,000 Iranian civilians through, and that's through estimates of Human Rights Watch, and maybe even more. And the Butcher of Tehran is assuming office today. If this were a different administration in power, do you think it would be possible to conduct such a strategy using the dissidents, the good dissidents that have been up until today, recently on the streets of Iran, saying things like, forget about Gaza, forget about Beirut, think of us?
Well, the Iranian regime has a substantial domestic opposition. And we know that because Iran is very connected to the world over the internet. And so there's actually quite a bit of visibility into the reality of the Iranian streets. And we get to see substantial evidence of political unrest and mass demonstrations. And there's a lot of unhappiness with the Iranian regime. The US economic sanctions that were imposed a few years ago by the previous administration caused severe economic distress throughout Iran. They were very effective, much more effective than almost everybody believed that unilateral US sanctions could be. And the result is there was a severe cut in Iranian oil exports, devastating effects on the value of the Iranian currency. And so the price of goods in Iran for ordinary people has gone up enormously. So Iran is under really severe economic pressure, and that has brought large numbers of people out into the street in protest against their government. It's also constrained the Iranian government in the amount of subsidies that they can provide to the rebels in Yemen, the Houthi rebels, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to Hamas. Now, while the United States imposed those sanctions a few years ago, there are right now negotiations underway by the Biden administration to try to revive the nuclear deal, and basically the carrot that is being dangled before the Iranians is relief from those sanctions. It's not entirely clear whether that carrot will work and whether they will actually get the Iranians to make the kind of concessions that that the Biden administration wants to, as the price for reviving the deal. But the issue, the main issue that is driving the negotiations is the economic pressure that the Iranians are under. And this, as I said, this economic pressure is causing a lot of political turmoil in Iran and protests against the government. There are a number of people in the United States, and there was an article about it in today's Wall Street Journal, as an op-ed about it in today's Wall Street Journal. A number of people in the United States say that the United States should build on the accomplishment of the economic pressure that we've put on Iran to support the opposition to the Iranian government. And the United States government has not said that that's an aim of US policy at this point. Interestingly enough, Trump, who put on the severe economic pressure, also did not say that it was an aim of his policy to support the opposition groups against the government. And you referred to something that we had talked about earlier, which is the approach that the United States took toward the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And just a word on that. What Ronald Reagan did when he became president is he changed American strategy in the Cold War. American strategy had been to promote stability and what was widely known as peaceful coexistence. When Ronald Reagan was asked what his strategy is toward the Soviet Union, does he still adhere to the idea of peaceful coexistence and stability? He said, no. He said that his strategy is we win, they lose. Now, that was kind of a flip remark, but it was a flip remark about a truly serious strategic change in the approach of the United States. Reagan's strategy was comprehensively to apply pressure on the Soviet government to aggravate the internal contradictions of Soviet government, Soviet society, and to put so much pressure on the Soviet regime that it would collapse. So what Ronald Reagan did is he had a 360-degree policy of pressure. He had military pressure that was applied by, for example, arming the jihadists in Afghanistan against the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. He had missile defense to negate the benefits that the Soviets got from their offensive nuclear weapons. He had economic pressure, limiting the Soviets' access to American high technology by using export controls. He tried to block Soviet gas exports to Western Europe. He had political pressure on the Soviet Union, condemning their human rights abuses, supporting Soviet dissidents, expressing sympathy for the Soviet dissident movement. Anyway, across the board, in every sphere, in every way, the United States was putting military, economic, diplomatic, human rights, and other pressure on the Soviet Union. The result was that
Gorbachev and the leadership of the Soviet Union decided that their policies were not sustainable. And it drove them to experiment with reforms that wound up undoing the Soviet Union and causing the collapse of the Soviet government, which brought about the most stunning and successful strategic victory in human history, the destruction of the Soviet Union without war. It was an amazing accomplishment. And what your question was implying is, if we could do that to the Soviet Union, which was a superpower, would it not make sense for the United States to have a comprehensive policy toward the Iranians that would put pressure on them, not just economically, as we're now doing, but also more pressure militarily, more pressure diplomatically, and more pressure through support for the political opposition in Iran to the Iranian government? And I think there's a lot to be said for that, but it's clear that the current administration is not thinking along those lines. It's worth noting that the Trump administration did not think along those lines either. The Obama administration was actually on the opposite side. They were thinking that not at all of undermining the Iranian government, but instead reaching out and trying to create some kind of strategic cooperation between the United States and Iran. But it's also important to point out that the George W. Bush administration didn't adopt that policy toward Iran either, because once the war in Iraq started going badly, it was clear that President George W. Bush was not interested in promoting what would have been described as yet another regime change policy in the Middle East. So we have not adopted the kind of policy toward Iran that Ronald Reagan adopted successfully against the Soviet Union. And this has been a bipartisan reluctance, unwillingness to adopt a policy of that kind. But I think there's a strong argument that strengthening the hand of Iranian political dissidents would be beneficial.
Absolutely. And now it's my supreme honor and pleasure to turn the podium over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who's the director of a METS program for emerging democratic voices from out of the Middle East. Hussein?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Douglas, for such an insightful discussion of Hamas and the current situation inside the Palestinian territories. And thank you very much for our audiences who sent us so many questions. I'll try to get to as much as we can of them, and I will try to combine some of them together so we can just get to as many as possible. You talked a lot about the optics and how Hamas, one of the main strategic goals of Hamas is actually the optics of the conflict. So actually we received multiple questions concerning that, asking if the optics is really the primary concern of Hamas. Should we trust all of the data that comes out of the Gaza Strip regarding casualty and destruction, given the high premium that's already there on blood and casualties?
No, I think that the short answer is no. Hamas should not be given credibility. Hamas is not the only source of information about casualties. There are reporters there, and there's sometimes groups that that operate in the area that also provide some information. But the basic point that we should be skeptical about casualty reports that we get from areas that are controlled by undemocratic powers is a very important point. It certainly applies to Gaza, but it applies in many other areas of the world also.
Thank you. We received also multiple questions concerning the issue of optics that I will combine a few of them together. Why can't the world, or I guess the person means a public opinion, does not understand what Israel is up against, how can we improve our own PR and not just be reactive, but also offensive in terms of telling the truth on the ground?
Well, I think that Israel has a problem similar to one that afflicts the United States also. And that is the asymmetric strategies that are directed against Israel and the United States because of our general military predominance. I mean, when the United States operates militarily in the world, nobody can easily expect to be able to defeat the US military. Likewise, Israel in its region. And so the asymmetric strategies that are directed against Israel and the United States, which aim at getting political effects without having to defeat our armed forces, those strategies are inherently broader than military. In other words, they're fundamentally political strategies. Even though they, in the case of Hamas, involve firing rockets at Israel, it's fundamentally a political war that Hamas is fighting against Israel at this point, because it's not strong enough to defeat the IDF at this point. So there's a problem, which is that the Israelis, like the Americans, don't take proper account of the role of political operations in the wars that are directed against them. And so the example that I would give to highlight this is nobody in either Israel or the United States would dream of saying, if we have a war, we're going to start manufacturing bombs as soon as the war starts. Nobody would say that. Everybody would recognize if you're going to prepare your defense, you have to manufacture your weapons, you have to manufacture your ammunition in advance, you have to have stockpiles, you have to be ready to go. So when the war starts, you've got your weapons, you've got your ammunition, and you've trained your forces. Interestingly enough, though, when Israel knows it's had already 4 wars in recent years against Gaza, against Hamas in Gaza. When the war started in May, Israel should have had literally hundreds of articles written, ready to be published. You didn't need to wait until May to know what you needed to say in those articles about how Hamas was inhumanely and illegally placing military supplies in civilian locations. All of that was known. The law is known. The arguments are known. Where were the articles that were ready to deploy the way bombs would be ready to deploy in a war? They were not written in advance. Where are the hundreds of spokesmen trained to go out and do television interviews so that you could flood the zone with well-informed people who know the law, who know the politics, who know the situation, who can describe things? They didn't have them ready. Now, nobody would dream in Israel, as I said, of saying we're not going to prepare our military ammunition until the war starts. And yet they don't prepare their political ammunition or their legal ammunition until the war starts. And this is a problem that Israel has. It's a problem the United States has. And I think that if our national security officials took a more sophisticated approach and understood the enormously important political component of the strategies of our enemies, and we wouldn't prepare only for military confrontations narrowly defined as military, but as, we would prepare better for asymmetric warfare, where we have to counter not only military threats, but political threats. And we would integrate the training of people who can do the military, the political and the diplomatic work, integrate that with the people who do military work. And when we did war games and exercises, we would integrate the political component into the war games and exercises, as we do not now do. I think we could improve the situation substantially. Our enemies have integrated military and political, but we have not to the same extent. And I think that's a failure for both Israel and the United States. And I hope we can both remedy the failure.
Right. Just to follow up on that, do you believe that Israel internalized any of these lessons from this last war and might be applying them to the next round?
I don't know. I know that they've gotten some, I think, some useful, incisive, constructive criticism. It's hard to move bureaucracies, and a lot of military people are uncomfortable dealing with it. This is part of the reason. This is the essence of asymmetric strategy. You identify gaps in your enemy's capability and you exploit those gaps. Well, Israel's enemies understand that professional military people are uncomfortable with political and legal arguments. And because they're uncomfortable, they shy away from them. So that has created a vulnerability, so that the Hamas people have specifically designed a strategy to take advantage of that vulnerability in Israel. And America's enemies have done similarly against the United States.
Thank you. I have several questions that I'm also going to combine. Basically, given the current prominence of Hamas, is it in the best interest of Israel to try to empower the PA, flawed and problematic as it may be, to counter the weight of Hamas and even maybe to replace it in Gaza?
My view is that as long as the Palestinians have the leadership of the poor quality of Hamas and the PA, and there are differences between them, but they're both what I would say is substantially below minimum standards. As long as they have really poor quality leadership that is corrupt, leadership that is ideologically extreme and inflexible, leadership that considers compromise with Israel to be dishonorable, the Palestinians are going to suffer terribly. The Israelis are going to suffer to some extent. I think the Palestinians suffer even worse from the poor quality of Palestinian leadership than the Israelis do. The Israelis have a way of getting on with life, and the conflict is not their whole life, whereas the conflict to some extent depresses the whole life of the Palestinians who live under the PA and Hamas. And it's a terrible misfortune for them. Until the Palestinians get better leadership than both Hamas and the PA, you're not going to have a substantially better situation for the Palestinians, and you're not going to have a brighter prospect for peace with Israel. So I think the goal should be cultivating a better Palestinian leadership. And I think that the Abraham Accords hold out some possibility of progress in that area, because there seems to be a lot of impatience on the part of the leaders of the Gulf states and elsewhere, a lot of impatience about the poor quality of Palestinian leaders. And I think the Arab states may have more information, more inclination to try to change the political landscape for the Palestinians than people in the West do. And if they change the political landscape so that a different and better Palestinian leadership can arise, then it will be a great benefit for both the Palestinians and ultimately the chances for some kind of peace deal with Israel. But unless and until they change the current leadership, both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, I don't think the Palestinians have a way forward.
Unfortunately. This is actually a perfect segue for our next question. It's actually about the wider region. In the context of the wider geopolitical confrontation between the so-called axis of resistance and the opposing Arab bloc, where do Arab states currently stand on the issue of Hamas? And why did Egypt seem to have changed its position from Hamas during this last war?
Well, I think that the Arab states in the Gulf have an overriding concern about the threat from Iran that they consider to be a life and death threat to them. And that's why the UAE, Bahrain, the Saudis, and others have been either willing to directly engage Israel or to kind of cheer, as the Saudis have been doing, kind of cheer from the sidelines, the Abraham Accords. And they have an interest in fighting Iran that is, as they see it, life and death. And they have a recognition that Israel is a valuable, uniquely capable ally for them in fighting Iran. And at the same time, I imagine there's a lot of residual sympathy in general for the Palestinians, but there's a lack of patience with the Palestinian leadership, because the Palestinian leadership has been so corrupt and so poor in its judgment that even people who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause in general are out of patience with the PA, let alone Hamas. Now, there's a special antagonism that they have toward Hamas because Hamas has been a strategic ally of Iran against Israel. And since a lot of the Arabs in the Gulf think of Iran as a life and death enemy of theirs, they're not interested at all in doing anything to help Hamas, which is an ally of their life and death enemy. And so I think that what has happened is that Israel has demonstrated its usefulness as an ally to the Arabs. And this hasn't completely canceled pro-Palestinian sentiment in these Arab countries, but the political leaders of these Arab countries understand the situation in a much more complex way, that even though they may have sentiment in favor of the Palestinians in general, they understand that Israel's useful to them. They understand that Israel can be useful not only against Iran, but also for economic development. Trade with Israel is useful, and they can express sympathy for the Palestinian people, but they can also condemn the corruption and bad judgment and bad behavior in general of the Palestinian leadership. And I think that's the situation. But there are, it's not a simple matter that these Arab countries have become all of a sudden pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian. These are complex situations. And I think what you were describing, that Egypt looking like it's flip-flopping a little bit on Hamas in Gaza, is an example of the cross currents that I'm describing. There's not a single current. There are conflicting cross currents going on. And so sometimes they have to the Egyptians are very tough on Hamas because they don't like the connection to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. At other times, they like to be a little friendlier to Hamas so that the Egyptians can play a moderator's role between Israel and Hamas. It's a complex picture.
Thank you. It is indeed very complex, but you offered an extremely insightful survey of those complex dynamics. We're going to stay with the region, but now from the leaders to popular sentiments. As seen as in the recent events in Tunisia and the protests in Iran, political Islam seems to be retreating generally in the region when it comes to popular sentiment. Why does the opposite seem to be true among the Palestinians? Why is it gaining support among West Bank Palestinians while it seemed to be losing steam in the wider region?
Well, political Islam has been very disappointing to a lot of people throughout the wider region. And so it's losing support among the people who have who believe that it's had very ill effects. I mean, a lot of Egyptians were very unhappy with the Morsi leadership of Egypt, and even people who are not necessarily great fans of the current military dictatorship in Egypt feel at least some gratitude that they got rid of the Islamist regime of the Muslim Brothers. Among the Palestinians, first of all, it's not clear how much we really know about Palestinian public opinion. And I think we have some insights. There's a lot of access to Palestinians, and so one can do public opinion polling there, for example. But what a lot of people in the West don't appreciate is when you are doing public opinion polling of people who are living under unfree regimes, you have to be very skeptical about the results of those polls. Because the people who are living under these unfree regimes that punish their political opponents, and sometimes punish them very severely, I mean, beat them up, imprison them, sometimes kill them, those people are not free to simply express their opinion. And they worry that the people who are taking the polls may be reporting to the government. And so I think we just have to be skeptical. And it's unfortunate because we really would like to know what public opinion among the Palestinians is. And as I said, some of it has some credibility, but I think in general, we have to be aware that we don't really have a clear and reliable picture of public opinion, because both the PA and Hamas take measures to punish their and people who deviate from the party line.
Doug, if I could just interject here, Hussein and I have often quoted recently the recent poll, the Shikaki poll from the Palestinian Center for Survey and Research, which given the constraints that people have, makes it even more alarming that 70 to 77% of the population that live in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, if you will, actually under PA control, want Hamas control. So, this,
we do get some indication of public opinion with elections. The fact that Mahmoud Abbas scheduled the first election in something like 14 years. He was elected for a 4-year term. He stayed in office for 14 years and then scheduled an election, and then a few months later canceled the election. That tells you that he believed that he was going to lose. And so, as I said, there are ways of getting insight into public opinion in the West Bank and Gaza, but and some of the trends are understandable. Hamas got a lot of support when it first took over Gaza. It got a lot of support from people in Gaza who were not necessarily ideologically aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, but they were people who were disgusted with the corruption of the PLO officials. And then Hamas wound up taking over Gaza. And now there are a lot of complaints about the corruption of the Hamas officials in Gaza. But in the West Bank, where the PLO has continued to run the Palestinian Authority, there's an enormous amount of unhappiness with PLO corruption. And a lot of people say we'd prefer, as a protest vote, to support Hamas. Again, not necessarily because they're aligned with Hamas ideologically, but because they're so disgusted with the corruption of the current leadership. And so there's a throw the bums out mentality. Now, part of the problem, a major part of the problem that the Palestinians have, is if they throw the bums out in the West Bank, the only people that they're going to be able to get to replace them at the moment are Hamas people who've proven themselves to be bums in Gaza. And so there's a kind of out of the frying pan into the fire problem that the Palestinians are faced with. And I must say, anybody who really has any humane concern at all for the Palestinians should understand what a dreadful situation they are in, largely, not largely, but in part, because the world has done nothing to encourage the development of other Palestinian leaders. And the embrace of the PLO that goes all the way back to the early 70s, when the PLO put itself forward as the sole legitimate voice of the Palestinian people and was recognized as such by UN bodies and the Europeans and others, including eventually the US State Department. That recognition of the PLO as the sole legitimate voice of the Palestinian people was a catastrophic blow against Palestinian political rights. And Palestinian politics is in a horrible situation right now, where the main choices they have are between an unbelievably bad group of PLO people or an unbelievably bad group of Hamas people. And as I said, I think that anybody who really cares about peace and really cares about the plight of the Palestinians should be thinking, what can the aid donors, especially working with the Arab states, what can they do to encourage some leaders who are neither PLO nor Hamas?
Thank you very much, Douglas, and thank you very much for all our audience that submitted questions for us. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. We won't be able to take any more questions. Thank you, everyone.
Doug, I cannot thank you enough for, first of all, the years of service that you've given to the national security interests of the United States, and to the thought and wisdom that you have helped the government of Israel, our one democratic ally in the Middle East, with for decades and decades now. It is truly always an honor to be able to draw from and hear, listen to and hear and heed your words of sagacity, wisdom, and knowledge. Thank you so much. And I should say to our audience that all of this costs Ahmed a great deal of expense and energy and effort, and we really can and do appreciate anything that you can contribute to us. And you can certainly know how to donate to us by going onto our website at www.ahmedonline.org. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, Doug. Take care now, signing off.